All right, so let's focus on Chaz, Chop, and the statue. So I'm recording right now,
Right.
Alexander, and okay, so let's see. Which one do you want to start off with? You want to start off with Jenny Durkin? You want to start off with Sean King, or you want to start off with the latest in the lineup of statues that are being defaced or torn down, from Ulysses S. Grant to Don Quixote author? I mean,
let's go from let's start with Chop or Chaz or whatever it calls itself now, and Mayor Durkin and
Jenny Durkin.
Jenny Durkin, and the fact that
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
The summer of love has turned out to be a very hot summer indeed, it seems, in Seattle, because I understand what's been happening is exactly as we predicted. You take out the police, you create this kind of, I don't know what you call it, collective commune, a self-policing area, whatever. You appoint a warlord in charge, which is already an ominous thing. And of course, inevitably and unavoidably, we see crime and violence starting to increase around it. There's apparently been one murder. I'm not making any, I'm not claiming to know what the circumstances of that murder are, but there has already been a murder, apparently. There's been another shooting incident which is unrelated to the murder. There's been apparently cases of men being seen with, automatic weapons, which seems very radical for a peaceful protest. And inevitably, people are starting to complain. And inevitably, the mayor now is saying, well, maybe it's time to call this thing off. And the problem is, when you do that, which is exactly what we predicted would happen, we predicted that it would eventually start to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. And remember, it has only been sustained at all because the mayor and the city of Seattle, the city government of Seattle, were sustaining this thing. Inevitably, now that it's starting to crumble, there's talk about sending in the police. There is talk about, no doubt, resistance. I read somewhere that there's talk, barricades are being constructed in various places. It looks like we could have a face-off. Now, I hope and pray that this face-off, if it happens, will be resolved peacefully. When you hear stories about people with automatic weapons, you cannot guarantee it. And if there is a major outbreak, I can also see how, in that kind of situation, the governor and the mayor may be left with little choice, which is to turn to the federal government for help. Now, that would be a very interesting and rather awful scenario, but it was programmed into this right from the start.
All right, let me read you what Durkin said according to the AP, and I'm taking this from Zero Hedge, which says this: as AP reports, Mayor Jenny Durkin said at a news conference that the violence was distracting from changes sought by thousands of peaceful protesters seeking to address racial inequality and police brutality. She said the city is working with the community to bring the Capitol Hill occupied protest zone to an end. Quote, the cumulative impacts of the gatherings and protests and the nighttime atmosphere and violence has led to increasingly difficult circumstances for our business and residents, Durkin said. These impacts have increased and the safety has decreased. It's very interesting that now she's thinking about the taxpayers and the businesses and the residents of that area. And from what I understand, they didn't buy into this. They didn't vote for their 6 or 7, 8 blocks to be overtaken. These are taxpayers. The roads are paid by taxpayers. The electricity, the water, everything is taxpayer funded. The parks, all of it. So, I mean, this was without a doubt an occupation. She uses the word peaceful protest again, but I mean, that's, being disingenuous there. But she's saying pretty much this thing has gotten violent.
Well,
and she was on CNN saying it was going to be a summer of love. You mentioned that. Mm-hmm. So there you hear from the mayor, who it's really a dereliction of duty. I mean, she should be canned right away.
Absolutely, it's totally irresponsible. I mean, she talks about a peaceful protest, and at the same time, she talks about violence. How can there be violence in a peace? How can a protest be peaceful and violent at the same time? It is impossible. Now, the thing to understand about this is that this was an illegal occupation of public and private space, part of a city. That is an inherently violent or potentially violent situation. If people illegally occupy a space like that, keep the police out, because that's also a essential part of this, then that sets up the situation for violence. Now, this is so obvious to me. I cannot understand how a mayor of a great city like Seattle doesn't understand this. I mean, if she really didn't understand this, then she's not fit to be mayor. That's the first thing I'm going to say. Secondly, you're absolutely right. The law-abiding, hard-working people of Seattle, the people who pay their taxes, who obey the law, they can't be happy to see this extraordinary, illegal camp being set up in their city, occupying parts of their city in that way. And of course, it's having an effect on businesses. By definition, it would. Again, a mayor of a city needs to understand that. The reason there are laws is because those laws serve an important and essential social purpose. And as the mayor, she has a duty to uphold law. I mean, this is, again, so obvious to me. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think this is all about. I think that she and the governor of Washington State assumed that by allowing this thing to, establish itself in Seattle, it would goad Donald Trump into doing something that would be illegal and unconstitutional, which they would represent as being such, and that they would be able to make mileage out of it. Instead, he's done exactly what we said he should do, which is sit back and let this thing collapse around them. And now she's paying the price.
Assumed or was ordered to. I think that's the difference. I think the governor and the mayor were told what to do with Seattle, told by the Pelosi's, the Schumers, told by the Steyers and the Soros and the Ford Foundations and all these people behind what's going on. I think they were told. That's my opinion. Where are they getting the guns? Because from what I hear, this Raz Simone guy is passing out guns to everybody. Yeah.
AK-47.
Right. So where's he getting all of this stuff? All that,
yeah.
Where's he getting all of it? Did he bring this in with him?
Mm-hmm.
Or is he getting this funneled in? I think that's that's worth discussing. Yeah. I also think that if the mayor had not made this announcement, then I think Trump and the Trump White House should have done something, because you can't let this fester in a Maidan style. And maybe you want to talk about Maidan.
Absolutely.
And there was an interesting article from Tom Lungo, but also what we've been saying over the past, week or so about how this is similar to Maidan and color revolutions, everything like that. Because the Maidan, people were on that square. They weren't on that square for 1 or 2 days. The thing dragged out, and the authorities let it drag out. So I think if the mayor had not made that announcement, then I think Trump would have had to get involved in some way. The federal government would have had to step in some way. But the fact that she made that announcement, now I think Trump should just say, you know what? It's on you. You said it, Mayor. You made the statement. You're going to deal with it. Your words. And then Trump should just amplify everything she says and does via his social media accounts, because she has now accepted full responsibility. Those words are her accepting full responsibility of the situation, and she said, I'm going to deal with it, so now let's hold her to account.
Well, first of all, I agree. And can I just say, Tom Longo's article is an excellent one, and certainly people should read it, because it talks very well about how all of this whole scenario follows very closely the color regime copybook that we saw applied in Maidan in Ukraine in 2013 and 14. Now, what happened in Maidan Square is the main square of Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, is that it was taken over by anti-government protesters. The government did nothing basically to disperse them. This situation was allowed to continue for week upon week. The protesters got more and more violent. They became more and more armed. The government eventually lost control of more and more of Kiev. The police, upon whom the government and law and order in Ukraine ultimately depended, became demoralized. And eventually, the entire political system in Ukraine crumbled. Now, the reason that happened in Ukraine was firstly because the government in Ukraine was already very weak and was looking to cut deals and was corrupt and was frightened and all sorts of things of that kind. But the other factor was, of course, that the protesters in Maidan Square had the support of the United States and of the Western powers. The difference with Seattle is that this is now happening in the United States itself. So it carried no political cost for the Schumers and the Pelosi's and the DNC and the Obamas and all those people to support what was happening in Maidan Square because it was far away. But in a state like Washington State, in a city like Seattle, which is in the United States, where people actually have the vote and can vote in elections, well, that's a different thing. And we're not yet at that situation in the United States where the opinions of law-abiding people in a place like Seattle can be simply disregarded. You can ignore what people think in Kiev, but you can't ignore to the same way what people think in Seattle. But ultimately, if you look at the dynamic of what happened in Maidan Square and you look at the dynamic in Seattle, it's very similar. People who call themselves peaceful protesters take over a part of the city, and gradually the violence starts to grow. Inevitably it does, because that is inherent in this situation. Now, were the mayor and the governor ordered by the DNC? You think they were? So do I. I think this is following very much a particular political agenda. It's my opinion. I cannot prove it, but that's very much how it looks to me. And I have been saying this, and we've been saying this all along. Yes, there are real structural problems in the United States. No doubt there's issues of brutal policing. No doubt there's issues of, racial tensions and discrimination against Black people. But look at how organized these protests have been. Look at how carefully funded these protests are. Look how carefully directed they are to achieve certain political objectives. And it's obvious to me that this thing is being manipulated by people who are manipulating them for a certain political purpose. Now, the reason, as I said, that it's beginning to backfire in Seattle is because it is being done to Americans who are still American voters. The fact that the mayor and the governor have been forced to take the steps that we are now seeing, starting to say, well, we can't allow the situation to continue anymore because we're talking about violence and crime, shows that a tipping point has been reached in Seattle with the violence that is growing there. And eventually, yes, of course, the federal government of the United States has a responsibility to maintain order in the United States and to uphold the law of the United States. If the local government won't do it, then ultimately and eventually, in order to protect law-abiding US citizens, we mustn't forget them. I mean, there are law-abiding people in Seattle who are seeing their livelihoods and their lives being disrupted by this. and could ultimately find themselves in danger in order to protect those people for whom the US government has a legal duty. Eventually, if the local authorities don't intervene, the United States government must intervene in its place. Now, there are legal mechanisms in which to do that. I think that we're not perhaps quite at the point where those legal instruments come into play. But eventually, you cannot allow a great American city to be taken over in this way.
Yeah, I mean, for now, let's see what the mayor's going to do. She said she's going to take care of it. So there's no need for Trump to be baited at all.
Well, exactly.
There's no need for it.
Well,
I think that's where we are at this point in time.
I agree. I mean, he played it cool and he played it long, and so far it's worked for him. At the moment, I mean, I have to say now, after what Mayor Durkin has said, she owns it. She's admitted that there's violence. That she allowed all this situation to arise. She's admitted there's violence. She's admitted there's crime. Those were her words. I mean, you quoted them to me. Now it's her responsibility to take control. I hope she's able to do it peacefully, but perhaps she can't. We shall see.
Yeah, well, she's proven incompetent on a grand scale. So,
and so has the governor. And you talked about the DNC and all of those people. They must take responsibility for this also. Can I say again, allowing people to take control in this way of, open spaces within great American cities, especially where they appoint a warlord. Why does a peaceful protest need a warlord? I mean, isn't that already a contradiction? If you allow part of a city to be taken over in that fashion, you are creating conditions for a breakdown of public order, a violation of the law, and violence. And that is exactly what we see.
Okay, yeah, well, there's no doubt all of this is directed at Trump. It's all about 2020, November 2020.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that the Democrats, the oligarchs, the elite, the DNC, they'll do anything.
Yes.
Anything to get power
back.
They'll do anything, including destroying their own country.
Well, indeed. Well, this is it. I mean, this is what I find absolutely. I mean, this is the extent of Trump derangement syndrome, frankly, is that they're prepared to do things which I would never have thought possible. I mean, we've had the whole 3+ years of Russiagate, which was to be very clear,
dress rehearsal.
Well, I mean, it was also, I mean, an attack on the political and constitutional and legal system of the United States by its own institutions, which, I mean, I never believed that could ever happen in the United States, but it did. And now we're seeing them colluding at the collapse of public order and the rule of law in their own country.
All of this is a dress rehearsal. Russiagate was a dress rehearsal to see how well the media can dupe people into believing that Trump was actually a Putin puppet. And they got about half of the U.S. to believe it. And this has been one big dress rehearsal, I think, in order to see if people will actually go along and worship this new religion, which is what the whole BLM Antifa is. That's all it is seeing if people will actually get on their knees, wash people's feet, hold a fist in the air, do these crazy little passion play prayers. And it worked.
Well,
like 60% of the people actually buy into it.
Well, up to a point it's worked. But you see, we're now starting to see a pushback, which is why Jenny Durkin has had to come along and is talking now about ending the violence and restoring law and order in Seattle. So, people will be, pulled along for a while until they start to see the consequences. And in Seattle, clearly the consequences are very bad. I mean, one person has died. I stress, I'm not prejudging whatever investigation is going to happen. But I've heard, again, I don't know this for a fact, but I've heard that the police, when they were called to examine the incident, found themselves facing off against some of the protesters who are trying to prevent them coming there. So, I mean, all kinds of things are going on in Seattle, which are not good. And the local people are not happy. And they're right not to be.
Yeah, well, okay. So Trump is now saying that he's going to fine people $10,000 and I believe a year in prison. Any people involved in pulling down statues. And so this goes to the point that, as the Seattle thing winds down, they just, roll it over into the next thing.
Yes.
And this is obviously the next thing, and this will be the next thing for the next 2-3 weeks until we get the next thing. And it's just going to go on like this until November 2020. So we've had, at first it started with Confederate statues. They must go. Now it's moved to statues of just about anybody in U.S. history, colonial U.S. history, from Washington to Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln to Ulysses S. Grant. It's moved over to writers like Cervantes, who they've defaced his statue, which I don't even know why. It just shows that the people that are doing this are just dummies. They're useful idiots. There's no doubt about that either. So now you've moved on to that. Now they're looking at Teddy Roosevelt in New York City, and they're going to take down that statue because they say it's the composition. The composition is racist, but that's a matter of interpretation, and I can see how you can interpret it one way, but you can also interpret it another way. That's what art is for. Art is there in order to lead to a debate and to have people interpret it in their own opinion and to discuss it. That's why it's art, everybody. That's why it's art. But you're now at the steps of the museum. Pretty soon you're going to be inside of the museum. And the next step, Alexander, is to go after the religion and the church. And that's where Sean King comes in. Sean King is the person that was actually speaking for Bernie Sanders. He was one of Bernie Sanders' big sponsors and promoters. He's also one of the high-level priests in the BLM movement. And I say priests because it is a religion. I think it should be designated a religion at this point. He's one of the priests of the religion. He's it's so bizarre because he's a white guy from Kentucky who pretends that he's black. But anyway, that's the bizarro part of the whole thing.
But it's no more bizarre than so many of the other things that going on. But carry on.
Here's his tweet. Yes, I think the statues of the white European they claim is Jesus should also come down. They are a form of white supremacy, always have been. In the Bible, when the family of Jesus wanted to hide and blend in, guess where they went? Egypt, not Denmark. Tear them down.
But I mean, if we're talking about Jesus, I mean, Jesus was crucified by a Roman colonial governor. I mean, this is, if you want to take it, you could take it the completely opposite way, and that would be much more realistic. And Cervantes, I believe, I'm not absolutely sure of this, I'm pretty sure you'll find that he had to serve some of his time as a galley slave. So, I mean, 5 years as a galley slave. So, how does that make him responsible for slavery? I mean, the whole thing has now developed its own mad logic, which is, quite clearly an attack not on slavery or even on white people as such. It's upon the United States. Everything to do with the United States you're going to attack. So you go after Confederates and you go after Ulysses Grant, who defeated the Confederacy and whose armies came into the South and liberated the slaves there. But, he's a white man. He apparently owned some slaves before the war. So, you topple his statue too. And you're absolutely right, because there is no finite point where you stop. If you're going to go and say, you're going to start saying, you've got to change this, you've got to change that, you're going to topple this statue, you're going to topple that statue, you're going to go after Teddy Roosevelt because the statue shows him on a horse. It might be that he's shown on a horse because he was the president, or it might be because he's shown on the horse because he's a real person, whereas the other people in the group were not. Or it might be that he's shown on the horse because he played a major role in setting up the Museum of Natural History. But you don't care with any of those interpretations.
Right. Can I give you an alternative interpretation, though? I mean, when you look at a piece of art like that, there is an interpretation where people are saying it shows his supremacy.
Yeah.
Because on his left and right, he has a Native American and he has an African American, and he's on the horse. And I understand that interpretation of the composition. On the flip side, though, you can also look at it as he is the person that is bringing these forces together and moving them forward to a new America. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can interpret the composition. Go ahead.
Absolutely, there's many different ways you can interpret the composition. But of course, no, you have to remove it, or if you have to remove it, because if it's not removed, you might want to destroy it. And then you go into the museum itself, because lots of things inside the museum which you might disagree with. And by the way, it's a great museum. It's one of the greatest museums of natural history I've ever seen. It's one of my favorite museums in New York. But if you have that kind of cast of mind, then of course you can come after it. And if you want to come after churches and places of worship, why not all the art that's in those churches? Why not start, going into all the churches and destroying the works by Titian and, Velázquez and, or Botticelli and whatever, because of course those are symbols of white supremacy also, arguably. And, they were funded, some of them, by the wealth, you could argue, from the Indies, the colonial system. There is no finite point to this if you follow that kind of logic. And if you do it in the United States, it's spreading now, obviously, in other places. But of course, it is utterly destructive in the end. And there will be a backlash. There will be an enormous backlash eventually against it. But in the process, an enormous amount of damage will have been done.
Yeah, and finally, closing it out, Alexander, you also now have the universities where they're saying that Yale University, and this was actually a conservative, I believe a conservative writer was making the point that according to this logic, you're going to have to change the name of Yale University because the person it's named after was indeed a very profitable and well-known slave trader.
Yes.
I mean, that was where he made his riches.
Yes.
And so the university is named after him. But if you're going to follow that logic, then yeah, you're going to have to change the name of Yale University. I mean, and all 90% of all the universities, most likely in the U.S., are going to have a name change.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you're going to go after change the name of Yale, change the name of Washington D.C., named after George Washington, whose statue has been toppled. I think it was Patrick Buchanan who made a point that 2 years ago, was it 3 years ago, when there was an attack on Confederate statues, Trump said that it would lead down a slippery slope, and they'd end up attacking statues of Washington. And of course, what Trump said was ridiculed at the time. And here we are, the toppling statues of George Washington. So there is no finite point to this. And why stop at Washington D.C. if you're going to change the name of that too? You can find every single place in the United States. There's names you can change. There's statues you can demolish. And at the end of it, what will you have left?
Why not the Statue of Liberty? I'm sure you can make a case to demolish that, can't you?
Well, she's obviously a white woman, isn't she? So, I mean, you can go after her.
No, wasn't it a gift from France?
It was
Can't you make a case that France did something bad in its past?
Absolutely. Of course, we can do lots of things about France. I mean, they had the most brutal slave system of all in the island of Haiti. So why not France? And it was the time when the French were building the Suez Canal with terrible labor conditions for the Egyptian workers, of whom thousands died. So that was the time, as I said, roughly the time when the Statue of Liberty was made in France. So why not France too? I mean, why not the Statue of Liberty? Why not everything? I mean, obviously, I don't personally think we will get there because, as I said, there will be a massive backlash. But if this is the logic you adopt, that is where you will end up. You will end up where you will have to destroy everything, because what you are fighting is not slavery or racism anymore. You're fighting human history, which is complicated.
This has nothing to do with racism.
It's got nothing to do with it. You're fighting human history. You're fighting human civilization. I stress human civilization, not just Western civilization, but human civilization, because you want to start with the year zero and have everything begin anew. As we've discussed in other programs, in the 1920s, in the Soviet Union, There were people who argued that that's what should happen, and even the Bolsheviks thought that was going too far. So, but the logic of this points in that direction.
Yeah, well said. And Jesus wasn't thinking about Denmark, by the way, Mr. Showking. Just so you know. He wasn't thinking about going to Denmark.
No, he certainly wasn't.
It's crazy.
I mean, it is. I mean, it's not just crazy. I mean, it's just, it's beyond crazy. I mean, it's also, well, I quoted the famous poem by Yeats, which is called, by the way, its title is The Second Coming. But, the worst are full of passionate intensity. And that's what it seems to me that this is.
You know why he sends tweets like that? Not only for the attention and the trolling, but he sends tweets like that because the goal is you want to humiliate the religion.
Yes,
that's the goal.
Oh well,
you want to bring doubt, and you want to bring doubt about the religion. You want to humiliate it. You want to start creating the connection between the dirty word white supremacy and, in his mind, the dirty word Christianity.
Indeed, so though lots of black people in the United States are very, very religious. Many of them are Christians. Many of them are Muslims. So again, it's an agenda that has nothing to do with the real feelings of black people in the United States. It is I don't know, it's an anti-everything. Out with the old, in with the new, only you don't really actually say what the new is, because again, that's the difference, by the way, with the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks had a conception of the kind of society they wanted to create. This doesn't really, I mean, they haven't really worked it out in any way, but it's destructive. It is extremely destructive, and it is creating massive tensions in the United States. Can I just say something about Donald Trump's executive order about the demolition of the statues? As far as I am concerned, destroying statues is already against the law. It is clearly criminal damage. I think the purpose of this executive order is partly to make this a federal offence, but also partly to remind local governments that they have a duty to protect statues from criminal damage. Because one of the most shocking things is that, George Washington is toppled and the police sit by and do nothing. I'm sure that they would want to intervene to stop this happening, but they have orders to do nothing. And toppling statues is law breaking, and it is violence, just as taking over part of a city is law breaking, and it is violence, and it leads to other things. Inevitably and unavoidably it does.
Yeah, Tucker Carlson made that point in his intro last night, and he made a great point. Where are the Republicans in all of this? Where are the Republicans in all of this? They're more to blame than Democrats, because we know the Democrats are loony crazy.
Absolutely.
But the Republicans supposedly are conservative, hence the word conserve. They should be conserving this history. And he also made another good point where he said that the Republicans are tweeting about how awful Syria is and how they're going to impose more sanctions on Syria. Meanwhile, they're sitting back and letting their country's history, culture, and religion get vandalized, humiliated, made a mockery of by a bunch of useful idiot Antifa clowns.
Yes,
that's disgraceful.
Well, the Republican Party should be a force for stability in this situation, and it has absolutely removed itself from the scene. And it's terrible. I mean, I don't understand what function anymore the Republican Party has. They failed on Russiagate. I mean, that's why we're now finally catching up with events just a few weeks before the election. They failed on Russiagate, and they're failing again now. They're not really resisting this. They're not taking a stand. And I agree completely with what Tucker Carlson said. I mean, I find Tucker, by the way, is incredibly insightful when he talks about these things. And not for the first time. He's saying things which the Republican establishment are not saying, and he is right to do so. And can I say again, I mean, coming back to what Yeats said, the best lose all conviction. Those are part of the words in that poem. Now, I'm not suggesting by any conceivable stretch that the Republican Party are the best They clearly are not. As Tucker correctly says, they are so active in promoting wars and violence in places like Syria, in places like Yemen, in all sorts of places where they want the United States to escalate and increase the violence and involve more Americans in it. Because remember, these are American soldiers and American lives that they're committing to these adventures. But of course, on top of that, the terrible damage they're doing to all of those places. But they're not leading people in the United States in standing up for these things. So it's not surprising that in the United States, people who might have otherwise the courage to speak out, if some politicians were speaking out, lack the conviction to do so. And that's the kind of situation where things spiral out of control. Can I say, by the way, I've seen comparisons made. We've made them ourselves. Some of us have made them ourselves. With the period before the Russian Revolution, the period before in Weimar Germany. My own view is that the closest parallel is with Spain in the run-up to the Spanish Civil War, where there was again some remarkable and extraordinary things happening at that time. Monuments being toppled, churches attacked, and all of this, and it ended in a terrible civil war and the imposition of a terrible dictatorship. I hope that the United States doesn't go there. I don't think it will, but if it doesn't, it'll be because there are still people like Tucker speaking out.
Yeah. Or if Biden wins in November, then it will.
Well,
no doubt about it.
It is a slide.
Yeah. All right. We'll leave it there. Alexander, thank you very much. Guys, hit the subscribe. Go to Duran Shop. Take care.